what we're looking to do today is have a run-through of GDPR and what some of the challenges for businesses are going to be. And we look at addressing some of the hype that is coming out there, which may not be helping us focus on the right things in terms of giving the steer to businesses on what they need to be doing. So if we move on to the presentation, the agenda is as follows. So the context, business challenge, I want to look at some supporting technologies which can help deal with some of the GDPR challenges, and also focus on some of the upsides. I think there are new relationships to be made within businesses to help meet some of these challenges and actually drive some significant business benefit. And then we'll also look at how you can leverage some of your existing security services and technologies to get some benefit in the GDPR space. So moving quickly on to context, just looking through the basics, the infographic there has some of the high-level detail, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I always give a short introduction to this discussion for people that aren't from Europe or don't work within Europe, that the European view of privacy is quite different to, say, the US. And that's down to the unfortunate history last century of how information had been used by state organizations to profile people with the very unfortunate consequences that occurred. So it's that experience that has a direct influence on what's included as personal information in the EU privacy legislation, certainly before GDPR and definitely in GDPR itself. So there are a number of things that are introduced with GDPR. A lot of the basics stay the same in terms of what you would find in the Data Protection Act in the UK, but some new things have been introduced. So the concept of the right to be forgotten, where a data subject can request that an organization removes records related to them. Data portability, so again, the right for a data subject to ask for the data from an organization that holds it in a format that is easy for the data subject to take it to someone else. So think of utilities organizations here and potentially banks. This is designed to help people move more freely and easily between organizations. Transfer outside the EU is clarified in the sense that it is now explicit that the requirements of GDPR follow the data. Wherever an organization moves it, the obligations follow the data around the world. And something that's probably got a lot of press is the obligation to report breaches to the data protection authorities within 72 hours of identifying a breach has occurred. So there's a lot of talk about the fines, so the 4% of annual global revenue or 20 million euros. We'll talk a little bit more about the hype in a second, but you know, something to call out straight away is that the largest fines are imposed for improper capture or use of data, not for breach. So let's dive straight into that hype again in a bit more detail. So we just referenced this, that 20 million euro or 4% fine. Security organizations just simply should not be telling you that there's a 4% fine for a data breach. There's a separate structure within the regulation which carries a maximum fine of 2% for a data breach on its own. Now, of course, that can still be significant, but there are some areas in the article related to the powers of the DPA which really should be called out, I think, in advance to the business. And if you look at Article 58, E through J, in an sort of increasing scale of impact to the business, the DPA would, which in the UK would be the Information Commissioner's Office, would have the right to or the power to force you to make notifications to data subjects if you had a breach, would have the power to stop you doing what you were doing. So if they felt a process was fundamentally at odds with the requirements set by the Act, not just from a security perspective, they had the power to stop you performing that immediately. They could then follow that up with the power to require you to delete anything related to that activity that meant that you gathered information you shouldn't be holding because you didn't have, for example, consent to hold it. It can also remove licenses from you to interact with other organizations and ban cross-border transfer of data. And it's at the bottom of that set that the fine clauses come in, and you do wonder that if they've stopped you doing your business, asked you to delete everything that you had, removed licenses and stopped you moving the data across borders, what's left? So there's a discussion to be had about the negative side of the consequences of failing to comply with GDPR, but I honestly feel that the focus on the fine is the wrong place, because it does give a sense that you could take maybe a gamble and say, well, we'll see if we're caught. However, the powers that are granted to the DPAs in Europe are much wider, much broader, and much more business impacting. And again, the focus of the regulation is around the proper use and capture of data. So where you're not doing that part, the fines and the potential consequences are actually much greater. So the second piece of hype is trying to position it as a security standard, and that it's significantly new. Well, data security is explicitly mentioned, but only in a few articles, relative to all of the other consent, data capture, and data processing requirements that are put there. And in terms of is it new, it should look very familiar. If you're familiar with Principle 7 of the Data Protection Act, the wording is very, very familiar in terms of setting out the requirements. Probably the last piece is some vendors or partners pushing products to say that you just need to do this. If you do this one thing, you'll be in compliance with the requirements and you'll be fine. But I think hopefully we're old enough and wise enough to know that there aren't silver bullets in the security space, and this is no different. There are no single processes, there are no single products you can use to deliver compliance on its own. So that's some of the hype, but if we look at some of the potential upsides here, which are probably less focused on, there's the potential of market differentiation. If you're seen to be an early adopter, be seen to be doing things properly, interacting with authorities and data subjects in a good way, there's a potential to set yourself apart from your competitors. There's an opportunity to lower IT, total cost of ownership, around managing the right data and only having the right data volumes and not having a lot of legacy data. There should be advantages in having better data quality, so business decisions made on MI should be more reliable, and that should lead to greater business benefit faster. And of course, by doing this, we are looking at reduction in security risks, which may well expand beyond just the data that's in scope for GDPR. They could introduce practices which can follow other forms of data across an organization. However, my sad prediction is that we are still going to have months of hype, months of people trying to push their products. So our attempt here is to get you to focus on some core areas that may or may not be in your mind at the moment. There may be things that you've started thinking about, or you'll go away from this with a renewed interest in looking in these areas. So I want to spend the focus of the talk really on what I see as the business challenge that needs to be addressed. And it's really one that most organizations just aren't very good at data management, especially organizations that aren't currently regulated. It's not a discipline that many organizations have had to invest in, and it's typically immature. But both big data opportunities and GDPR need this new discipline, and we're broadly calling it data governance. And one of the most important things to note straight away is that it's not just an IT role. Effectively, what we're looking at is mapping out a business process and data flows in enough detail to be able to answer some questions, such as, should we have this data? Can we use it like this? Where is it? Who can access it? And is it up to date? Now, a number of those you can see relate directly to security, but some of them don't. So hopefully this reinforces the point that this isn't a security activity in its own right. This really does need interaction and participation from the business as well. Going through this approach is going to help you meet some of your obligations in terms of privacy by design and performing privacy impact assessments. These are going to be things that you need to evidence should a regulator ever ask you to demonstrate your compliance to GDPR. So where's my data and who has access to it? That's a challenge in security, even when you're not considering personally identifiable information. So if you look at this sort of fairly standard depiction of different entities that are going to interact with your systems and information, recognizing that also controller and processor obligations have been made clearer with the same very similar accountabilities being laid on both processor and controller. So you look at that sort of ecosystem and then overlay, bring your own device, bring your own application, which is sometimes even more dangerous, where your employees or suppliers may be finding different tools to do their work more efficiently, which you might not know about. Adoption of cloud services, and of course shadow IT, the adoption of IT services without visibility or sanction of the IT function. So they're really going to be significant challenges for an organization that may not have been managing its data in a particularly robust way to this point. I'd just like to talk in a little bit more detail about cloud. There are a number of very good cloud providers out there that can offer fit-for-purpose solutions. What we would stress is really understanding what you're buying. Here's a depiction of Microsoft's Azure shared responsibility model, which really is just a sort of visual cue to recognize that the responsibility changes depending on what you've bought and how it's been implemented. And you need to know this. So the cloud offerings have matured over the years, and many of them can be aligned to regulatory regimes. We will be seeing AWS and Azure offering alignment to GDPR requirements in there. And of course, there's a lot of territorial focus on the location of data centers and where the services are provided from. But as I say, it really is a situation of knowing exactly what you've bought to make sure that you understand who should be doing what. So looking at the data governance process, if you like, where we're looking at getting sort of privacy by design baked into how you operate. We're looking at a simplified information lifecycle here, and what we're going to do is overlay different views, and we think this layered approach is a very good way of making sure that you're picking as many GDPR relevant areas as possible off this sort of simplified architecture. So for the data governance team, again, we're trying to highlight that this is not an IT accountability on its own. You would expect to see representation from IT, security, and then, very importantly, business users or business representation for people who have asked for the data to be collected in the first place, to be able to do something with it. So be it to deliver services, be it to deliver advice. Those people really need to be in the heart of the discussion, so they are making it very clear what it is they want to do. So the other people within the governance group can make informed decisions on whether that's appropriate or what controls may be required to protect it. So that's the business users, and then, as expected, legal representation and audit and compliance. So the first layer that we put on is a data architecture one, and a critical piece is having some data standards in there that help you identify and recognize the particular types of data that you are going to gather, so you can follow that through this life cycle. There will then be standards on data transfer, data storage, some other techniques around anonymization if required, requirements for how it should be retained, and then ultimately destruction when the information is no longer needed or there is a regulatory requirement to stop holding it. So that's the data architecture view. The next view is a system and service architecture. So this is where you start putting in your system standards and your system policies. You start introducing sort of controls and processes at this stage, looking at how you would test your systems to make sure they're compliant with your standards. So you start, again, specifying how data transfer and data storage happens at these various stages. I think it's also important to sort of highlight this is a very simplified model. In the data manipulation area, there may be 2 or 3 cycles or processes that happen. You need to do this mapping for each of those to make sure that you are putting the right governance overlay on that actual business activity. So you need to go down to a granular level where the treatment of data or the collection of data may be different. The next governance layer to look at is identity and access management, obviously a critical one. And here we're trying to highlight the fact that the interaction with data is going to change and be different and have different groups in these different stages of the life cycle. So from a data capture perspective, it's probably got the customer directly involved, or the data subject, and maybe some operators and agents. As you move on to actually using the data or manipulating it, you're bringing in different business users, data analytics tool sets, and possibly a different set of administrators as well. So what we're trying to highlight here is just that understanding that the system is unlikely to be one platform, that everything is done in one place. So you need to map out these stages and make sure that you are considering which entities, be they insourced or outsourced, are actually interacting with the information. The next layer to look at is legal. That whilst there are other legal inputs and accountability to look for, obviously for this discussion we're focusing on consent. And it's mapping out that the consent that you've requested at the point of data capture is consistent through your process. So do you have the consent for the activity that you're proposing to do, to transfer the data from system or territory or entity? And do you have the consent to grant access to third parties or other partners to be able to execute that business process? So again, getting the granularity right is going to be critical, because those consent questions have to follow where the data moves and where it interacts with different people and different entities. We're now looking at the security and compliance layer. Pretty much as you'd expect, it's making sure that the system policies, security policies and standards are in place, that the third-party evaluations are being executed, and that security monitoring and testing is appropriately delivered. This needs to be supported by a compliance regime, which is going to make sure that that is done on a repeatable and consistent manner. So hopefully that comes across as a sort of structured way of looking at a business process, to be able to answer a number of different questions which you're going to need to be able to answer to demonstrate your compliance with GDPR. So we think this is one of the most structured ways of going about this. It should be repeatable, and importantly, it can form an important process of how organizations operate. Once you've done this, you can move on with more sort of certainty into your risk assessments and privacy impact assessments, with that knowledge of where the system is, what's in it, who interacts with it, and what controls there are. Important to understand that it's a process. So this isn't a project. This is likely to have an impact on how you operate and the interaction between different parts of your business. And it needs to be governed through business change management. So if there is a change or a request to use data in a different way, it needs to go through that governance group that's able to assess whether or not that is appropriate, whether it requires different consent requests, or whether control environments need to change. So yeah, we recognize that that is no small challenge to address, especially for organizations that are in fairly immature states from that point of view. So we've looked at some supporting technologies which can help underpin that process. And again, we'll labor the point here that these tools help run a process, but the first step is understanding that's a process that you need to run. So we've grouped these in fairly high-level categories. So finding your information, assessing it from both an assessment of the data itself and also the control environment it's under, and then how to manage it going forward. So we're going to make a few references to types of technologies and products that can help in that space. So from the case of finding it, our observation is that e-discovery and records management tool sets are very well suited to doing this. It's a small retasking for them, really, to look for personally identifiable information. So if those are in place, they're a very good place to go and see whether they can be adapted to the task. There is some utility that you can get from network and vulnerability discovery scanning tools. This could be as simple as running a discovery scan and identifying where you have database servers, SharePoint servers, for example. At least that gives you some understanding of how many there are, and you can start doing a deep dive to try and understand what data may be contained within them. So, you know, that's going to give you a piece of the puzzle, but certainly not the depth that the e-discovery or records management tools would. And kind of alluded to it a little. I think whatever approach or tooling you use really needs to be able to support searching structured and unstructured repositories. So databases might be a little bit easier, but you really need to be considering if PII could be living in file and print servers, in SharePoint, in whatever version of Box you may have as a cloud service, or, which it probably will, some of it lurking in email. So your searching approach needs to consider those challenges. So in that space, obviously we've seen the records management tools, so HP's Universal Discovery or the autonomy tool sets are very good there for network and vulnerability discovery. Standard tools like Qualys, Rapid7 are probably the things to look for there, just to give you that very basic information. So in terms of assessing the data, can't stress this enough, you really do need to get specialist legal assessment of the data. There's a lot of folklore running around on LinkedIn and Facebook and things in various media channels. Once you've found your data, you need a legal professional to give you the certainty that it's correctly classified within your organization, and you know what the corresponding requirements are for its management and protection. In terms of assessing the environment that the data lives in, maybe we're back to sort of more old school security here of doing vulnerability scanning and compliance verification, penetration tests, and reviews of any third parties that may be involved in managing the business process or hosting the data. That's something that we should be more used to. And for the last area of managing, again, I think it comes back to, if you're looking to automate things, records management tool sets are probably the place to go if you've got significant data volumes of a number of different data sources. They'll probably be the easiest way for you to manage going forward. And vulnerability scanning and compliance scanning, again, that should be an ongoing activity, as you'd expect. We can talk about encryption and tokenization and some other methods in a little bit more detail in a few moments, but there is some benefits, some definite benefit of encryption technologies to be used, and in this space we're sort of looking at combination of on-the-fly encryption, encryption at rest, database encryption. So looking at tool sets such as Voltage from HPE, Vormetric, that sort of thing, to deliver that encryption. For identity and access governance, which is going to be a fundamental piece of being able to demonstrate you understand who is accessing or who has the entitlement to access information, start looking at identity and access governance tools, the likes of Armada or Varonis from an entitlement perspective. They would be well placed to assist you in providing that visibility and managing those areas. We also predict that GDPR might create a sort of resurgence in the mobile device management space as there's recognition that the PII data is going to live outside the boundary of corporate systems and hosting. And I think the ones that have a skew towards containerizations will become ever more popular as it gives that ability to create that distinction between personal devices and corporate data, much more granularity on how to manage it, control it, and ultimately delete it when you need to. So, as I say, here's a tool set which can help with that process once you commit to looking through and managing that. Some of you may have pieces of this in place, which I would sort of recommend you look at how it can be expanded, or maybe slight retasking to deliver the support that we're looking for. So on to encryption, a sort of another area of misconception, I think, would be the fairest way to put it. So I'm going to talk about three areas. Pseudo-anonymization, which, as I say, I can hardly say, and certainly can't spell easily. Tokenization and encryption. So each of them have a role to play and different pros and cons. We're just going to go through those in a fairly high level. So starting with pseudo-anonymization, what we're looking to do here is mask or alter or obfuscate the actual data. So the pros obviously are a number of different options for implementation to varying degrees of security and complexity, and also persistence. I think one of the negatives would be is, given that granularity, making sure that the right choice is made for the right instance. So making sure that you are matching the level of obfuscation required against the sensitivity of the information. Making sure it's been implemented properly. Most of the media stories about failed encryption have come down to the incorrect implementation of encryption technologies. So there are certainly some gotchas in there, but it's a technique that can be used to assist in being able to use the information but still protect it. Tokenization in a similar space, but in a way possibly more robust, because the actual data is replaced in total with a token that can then follow a business activity. So the pro there is its security, because the data hasn't been transferred. It couldn't constitute a breach under GDPR. And also it's a widely used approach, widely adopted in areas where PCI DSS compliance is a requirement. The challenges are around the technology itself. So using a tokenization platform or product, it's not something that can easily be changed because of the challenges with legacy data and records in there. And also you want to be quite clear on the risks of or the future-proofing required to stop risks arising around using the tokenized information for different business purposes. So there is a risk that you will set up a token and not be able to use it for other areas. Now on to sort of full-blown encryption. Again, use many granular options used for protecting all stages of the data cycle. The pros are clearly tried and tested, recognized by DPAs as a privacy-enhancing technology. Specifically in the breach notification area, the GDPR regulation makes specific reference to this, that if you have correctly and robustly implemented encryption, and it is the encrypted data that has been lost, you don't need to undergo breach notification to individual data subjects, because it is deemed that they are not at risk because the data is not usable. Just to clarify, you still need to do a notification to the data protection authority if you do have a breach. It's just you do not have to go out to your customer base. The challenges there, I think, are, again, probably widely recognized. The complexity, implementation risks, this can be done well or it can be done badly. But it's definitely not a silver bullet. Started to track some odd discussions suggesting that if you just encrypt, you're compliant with GDPR. Hopefully, through this discussion so far, you've recognized that there are a number of other steps that are important, and not all of them relate to data security. So it's certainly not the case that encryption is all you need to do. Just as an example of how these capabilities can be glued together to give you a process, using here say just as an illustration, HPE's depiction of their tool sets. So they've retasked their data governance and records management tools to help identify, find PII information, use some logic to analyze it, potentially even an encryption stage, but also a tool set which will help managing the information going forward. So that's just an overview of how these things, how supporting technologies can be put together into a technical architecture that supports your business process architecture as well. So just on to some relationships and shared benefits that may come out of GDPR. So I alluded to some of these in the opening comments. So a number fall into a CIO or IT director's responsibility. So data cleansing exercises are likely to lead to lower IT costs, because as you've gone through and eliminated legacy data, which either you don't need or shouldn't hold under the new regulations, obviously less is being stored, less is being managed and protected, so that should reduce costs. This also could have a benefit with migrations and implementations of new systems. So if you're in a position to make sure that you're moving into, say, cloud solutions, only the data that needs to go, it should reduce implementation risks and implementation costs, rather than potentially lifting all the legacy data as well. And again, depending on the maturity of the organization, this could be a great opportunity for the IT function to get a much greater visibility and understanding of business processes and data flows, which is going to help them significantly in their interaction with the business and with potential other enhancements and innovations they could offer. And we're also expecting a consolidation of suppliers to be an outcome. So as you understand where the data is and who is providing services around it, there's an opportunity to consolidate and potentially remove some of those shadow IT providers, or bring them into the fold properly to deliver the appropriate security. So moving on to a different part of the business, general counsel or legal functions. Going through this process and being able to use some of these tools should help simplify compliance statements. So being able to have a robust process that you can evidence is being appropriately used is going to help with your requirement to provide proof of compliance. And also there may be requirements within the legal function that perhaps haven't crept over the bar in terms of things that have been executed before due to budget constraints or other priorities. Potentially this can reinforce the requirement for tool sets that will support other legal requirements or needs. So the last section we're going to look at is around the sort of marketing area, broadly looking at stakeholder management, calling this the anti-hype agenda. This is where you can use the processes and approach that we've talked about to engage with shareholders and investors, to demonstrate how you understand what the requirements are and how you are meeting those requirements. It's going to give tremendous comfort to them to understand that you are managing negative consequences that could come from not doing this properly. It should also give comfort to your existing customers, and could well be something that would attract new clients or customers. The articulation of how you're on top of this challenge, it could well be a significant differentiator, especially as many organizations are leaving it very, very late to set these wheels in motion. So on to a section now where we'll look at how you can retask or use your existing security environment in a way that supports some areas of GDPR. Now, this is an area that's looking really just around protecting the data and preventing breaches. So it's not looking at addressing the consent challenges or the right to hold the data. But it's important to understand where the security products can provide some benefit. So if we look at a typical prevent, detect, respond sort of model, what we'd be looking for is being able to stop the breach happening in the first place. So making sure that access to information is appropriate to the task at hand. Being able to understand and detect whether or not you have had a breach, and to be able to go through and analyze the breach, to replay it, to understand what has happened, so you're in a position of being informed as to whether or not you need to do that notification to the DPA. And as we say, those of us who've lived through data breaches know how lively and stressed those can be. If that time is condensed down to 72 hours, you really want to be able to get information as quickly as possible. And then there's also the ability to look and analyze attack attempts to demonstrate whether or not breaches did occur or not, and also use that to validate your controls and potentially adapt them. So we've looked at these sort of more traditional security controls and sort of said that this is a way of automating your playbook in a way that you can demonstrate some of the areas that are required under GDPR are actually being done. So going into a sort of kind of more technology-focused view, what we're looking at and recommending is looking at a sort of central logic engine that can help you understand some things that are going on, make decisions, and automate some activity. So here we're looking at using SIEM as a core, which obviously we're putting log feeds into from sources, hopefully that you've identified as crown jewels or containing PII data. We've defined some scenarios where we think, well, if we see this happening, this would always be the action we want to take. And then we set this up and we enrich it with automated threat feeds and any other threat intelligence that comes in. And we use it to, when certain conditions are met, initiate automated instruction to security infrastructure. So this can be things that can support containment or change preventative controls, or to drive investigative actions. And again, I come back to this 72-hour piece. This approach could drive the automation of data collection, so you do have all the information together when you start trying to triage or analyze the incident. So we see this as an approach that really is a way forward in terms of getting much faster response to incidents and potentially preventing the data exfiltration, even if you can't prevent the infiltration. So obviously from a data protection perspective, they're very concerned about the data breach, so the extraction of information. So as with the original session, we hadn't planned an interactive session with the attendees. We're expecting 80 or so people, but what we had put in place was a short Q&A session, really a discussion. Introduce a colleague, Arshid Bashir, and I have asked him to sort of provide some of his insights of what he's seeing going on in the marketplace and interaction with some of our clients to drive a little bit more insight into some other areas.
Thanks, Gavin. So I guess to kick off some of the key questions I see arising across a number of different market sectors and segments I think the first one is that old chestnut that keeps reappearing with its head about, can we wait to see what happens after 25th May 2018, whether we need to do something or not? Can we hold off? And that's usually in the context of, well, isn't UK going through a Brexit?
Yeah, okay, interesting point. I think a couple of things. The legislation is very clear that if the data of a EU subject is moved out of the EU, that GDPR requirements follow the data. So if UK businesses are interacting with European nationals, providing services into European countries within the EU, I think it potentially becomes a moot point because the requirement is still there. But also, I think early indications are from the ICO that there's no desire to create further barriers to interaction and business with the EU, and they would look to create a very similar regime to allow that continued business and interaction with such a significant marketplace. So I'm sort of tending towards thinking it's a moot point because either the legislation requires you to do it because it's EU nationals, data subjects, or what the ICO implements is so similar that effectively it's the same thing.
No, they're good points, and I think when you look at any regulators, be it data protection or, say, financial services, they judge you against your peers as much as what the regulations and legalities are. The other thing, I mean, definitely more so in financial services, but in other industries as well. We've had stabs at getting data management and data governance. Why have success been so variable? And how do you think GDPR plays into that?
Yeah, so I think you'll probably see different levels of maturity, and probably in two camps. It would be in the businesses that are currently regulated, where there's a focus on the security of subjects' data. So I'm there looking at sort of financial services areas where their existing requirements probably drive more process thinking. And then there's the other part where, other than data protection, they haven't had very structured regulatory requirements to meet. So I think it's probably tougher for those organisations because it's unless they've done it for their own sort of benefit or competitive advantage, that they haven't been in that regime of data governance and managing data properly. So I think GDPR is going to be significant because it almost forces that requirement, as we've discussed at length, to manage data in that way to a large community that hasn't had to do it before. So I think it should drive adoption of this sort of process engineering and process governance forward, but I don't expect it to be an easy or comfortable ride for a number of organisations, which is why we were trying to highlight some approaches and tools which may help.
And we see that there isn't necessarily one right approach to doing GDPR projects and programs. It can be led by the legal departments, or it can also be led by technology. Where do you sit in this? Where do you think ownership lies, and who should actually lead these activities?
Yeah, interesting question. I'm working out how to duck it. I think there are, done in the right way, I think the ownership could sit in a number of different places. So this is effectively becomes a question of legal compliance to regulatory requirement. However, obviously, there's a lot of a lot of responsibility given to IT functions who typically will be hosting the data and managing it on behalf of the business. But I think potentially a more progressive view of ownership would be to put it with the operational functions, because the data is there because the business is using it to drive business. So why wouldn't the business take ownership? So I think more progressive organisations are probably taking that sort of view, and you might see that manifest itself in maybe the attendance of data governance groups and forums, and potentially who even chairs it. So done the right way, almost anyone could take the lead. I think to really embed it into business as a way of working, business ownership is going to be important.
And do you think GDPR is helped or hindered by security standards and technologies? Is it two different things, or is it the same thing? We've talked about how security can help, but different people tend to take a different way. So what's your take on this?
So yeah, we've talked at length about business processes and the focus on GDPR about consent and using things in the right way, which I wouldn't say they're sort of security activities necessarily. So security's definitely got a role to play in situations where it's been able to operate in a cross-functional way within an organisation. So that experience certainly could help in maturing data governance organisations, and discrete security technologies can certainly help in discrete activities, but this isn't a security standard, and it isn't just a security or a data breach risk. So definitely got a role to play, but it's not the horse, it's in the cart.
So it comes back to the working together bit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Otherwise, it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So, and final question, and I see this in a number of organisations, is this view that GDPR and sometimes even security are discrete projects that have a beginning and end. Any thoughts?
If you approach it as a discrete project, you're committing yourself, maybe unknowingly, to running those discrete projects again and again and again. What we're talking about here is embedding a way of working and processes that security interacts with a number of different parts of the business. So you may potentially consider a project to get this up and running, but the outcome is a process. It isn't a one-off deliverable, hopefully not seen as a one-off deliverable to get a compliance tick at a point in time. You know, the output of this should be and must be a continuous process.
Yeah. So it's not a tick box exercise?
No. We certainly wouldn't recommend people to go down that path, because it might seem cheaper in the short term, but you're exposed to more risk, and you're almost certainly exposed to rerunning the projects later.
Good. Thank you for that. That was good.
All right, thank you, Arshad. Just want to wrap up with just some useful references. I wouldn't go as far as saying there's fake news out there, but I think you need to choose your sources of information carefully and make sure they're sort of reputable and it's advice you can count on. So we've included a number of references here which you might find useful to aid your sort of thinking, and obviously I'd get into trouble if I didn't also say that, of course, ITC would be more than happy to have further discussions and help you sort of assess your situation and provide advice on a way forward for you. But whether or not you do take up that offer, I think these sources are going to be helpful and useful to you as you assess your own situation and what you might need to do. So thank you possibly for the second time if you listened to the first version, and if not, we were glad we were able to record the second version, hopefully, so you can get all of the benefit of the information that we've put in there. The talk is going to be put up onto our website, and also we'll make the slides available in a PDF format. But yeah, just like to say thank you again to Arshid for his input, and thanks to you for your time. Thank you very much.